Well, friends, it's a great pleasure to welcome Jennifer Walters here this evening to speak to us. Jennifer came down from Lincolnshire to do an undergraduate degree in physics at the University of Kent, stayed on to do a PhD, and then had a research fellowship at University College London in the Condensed Matter and Materials Physics group. And it was while she was undertaking this research that she did some teaching, which she got fired up about, and after 5 years went off to do VSO in Tanzania, teaching physics in a girls' school. Returning, she carried on teaching doing her teaching qualifications, and she's now the head of science and innovation at Kent College, having been a physics teacher for over 20 years. But along the way, her journey took her to ordination, and she studied at Queen's in Birmingham and was ordained in the cathedral here in 2020. So you can see it's a rather exciting life, isn't it, really? I did just want to finish by reading you this bit from Jennifer's script, which she gave me, because I think it will fire us up to hear what she'd like to say this evening. Jennifer says, "I have a passion for sharing my love of science with anyone who will listen, and I have relatively recently come to understand that this joy comes from the fact that this is also where the roots of my faith first took hold." So, Jennifer, we look forward to exploring faith and science.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to indulge my passions. As Rosemary said, a few years ago, I took a break from my teaching career to follow another vocation, and I found myself in Theological College in Birmingham at the start of my ministry training. Now, I'm very familiar with water-based baptisms, but I have to say this really was a baptism of fire. It was my first encounter with the species known as the academic essay. All very new for a scientist, and nothing like writing a PhD thesis in physics. I've published quite a few academic papers in the past, but this was like speaking a very different language. As a scientist, I'm very used to asking a lot of questions and trying to work out the answers. However, in order to present an appropriate answer, I would look for evidence and present it in a logical, structured response. Not the best preparation for approaching a theological essay. I am going to oversimplify dramatically, but answering a question in theology, to me, seems to involve reading a lot of books and articles, some of which may have been written decades ago. Then the structure goes something like this. Learned person number 1 thinks this because of this. However, very learned person number 2 thinks this because of this. And 200 years ago, very learned person number 3 thought this. I agree with this person because of this. In science, there's not much room for opinion and subjective argument and discussion. Any discussion is heavily evidence-based, and things tend to change only when new evidence comes to light. This was quite a lot for me to get my head round, but it did get me thinking. There is no forum where scientists are still discussing Newton's interpretation of an apple falling from a tree. Newton's laws are accepted and we have moved on. However, it seems commonplace in other disciplines to discuss new interpretations of texts that were written centuries ago. So no wonder conversations between scientists and theologians can be challenging. It seems that we approach the world with very different perspectives and different ways of thinking. However, I think that what I want to try and say this evening is that although there are some very clear differences in perspective and approach, it doesn't mean that these approaches are necessarily incompatible. So, let's start at the beginning. A good place to start. Creation stories can be found in every culture. The Bible offers two versions, and also I've included an Aboriginal creation story. So, can we think of the scientific version as another version of a creation story? Scientists would argue that it all started with the Big Bang, although as science is always moving on, that's now become debatable. About 13.8 billion years ago, the observable universe went boom and expanded into being. You've probably heard of the Big Bang theory, but it's important to understand what that theory is and what it isn't. The Big Bang theory is not a theory of the creation of the universe. It is a model of the history of the universe, tracing the evolution of the cosmos back to its very earliest moments. And that's it. The Big Bang theory is a scientific model, just like any other scientific model. We believe the theory is on the right track because it's supported by extensive evidence. So the Big Bang theory can be summarized something like this. At one time, the entire universe, everything on the earth and in the heavens, was crushed into a ball about the size of a grapefruit at a temperature of about 1 trillion degrees. At the Big Bang, everything was denser and hotter than it is now, but there was no more an outside of it then than there is today. The universe didn't expand into space. Space itself expanded. Looking at this image, I don't know if you can read, but we can detect all the particles down to the smallest quarks, which would be around the yellow bits just outside the core of the explosion. But that's as far as we can go with measurements. So, and I encourage my students to ask the questions like this: how do we know that it happened? How do we know that this Big Bang actually happened? Or is it just a theory? Have we got any proof, any evidence? So what I'm going to do is just spend a bit of time describing some of the evidence which gives us the origin of our science creation story. So we'll start with this learned person, Edwin Hubble. Hubble noted that every galaxy, on average, is flying away from every other galaxy. The universe is expanding. And if you notice that every day the universe is getting bigger, you can make a leap of logic to come to the conclusion that long ago the universe was smaller. So, how do we know the universe is expanding? Well, we can measure it. What scientists do is they look at light coming from the stars around us, and when they look at this light, they find that the colour of the light is changed. And this change in colour is because the stars are all moving away from us and from each other. In physics, this is called the Doppler effect. Now, you have all experienced the Doppler effect, whether you know it or not. You can hear it with sound. When you watch Formula One racing on the television, it's the change in the pitch of the sound as the cars go past. So if I was in school explaining the Doppler effect, I would say, meow, that change in the pitch. And that can happen to light waves, just the same as it can happen to sound waves. And that, in light, is seen as a little shift in the colour. And the shift happens because the source of the light, like the source of the sound, is moving. And we know from the direction of the shift whether it's something that's moving away from us or towards us. So Hubble was right. Right, then we come to these two, Penzias and Wilson, and they found a second crucial piece of evidence. But as often happens with great breakthroughs in science, they found it by accident. They were using radio telescopes to listen to the signals coming from the universe. But they weren't very happy because there always seemed to be some background noise on their signals that they couldn't get rid of. A bit like an annoying crackle on a radio. They tried to work out what it was, and at one point they even thought it might be from the pigeon droppings on the telescopes. But they cleared all that off and it wouldn't go away. It turned out it was real. And what they were detecting was the leftover, very faint heat and light from the Big Bang explosion. We can still detect it, and we call it cosmic microwave background radiation. And we can map out what it looks like. It looks something like this. And in fact, for those of you who remember having to tune your TV in to the channels, I don't know, I remember our first television, a little black and white set, and you had to turn the dial, and then if you were lucky and you were holding the aerial in the right place, you managed to find BBC One. But this fuzzy, snowy bit in between the channels, about 5% of that fuzzy, snowy bit is actually your television picking up the cosmic microwave background radiation. Your television, as it was then, was picking up the leftover radiation from the Big Bang. So, we are as certain as we can be that the Big Bang did happen. As I've said, we found even the tiniest particles And we have data that tells us how the universe was a few seconds after the Big Bang had happened. At times before that, so before those first few seconds, our understanding of the universe gets, well, kind of fuzzy. The forces and energies, the densities and temperatures just become too high, and the knowledge of physics that we've gained over the centuries just isn't up to the task. In the extremely early universe, gravity starts to get very important at small scales. This is the realm of what we call quantum gravity, and it's one of the great yet to be solved riddles of modern physics. We just don't have an understanding of strong gravity at small scales. So, a good question would be, what was there before the Big Bang? Earlier than the grapefruit, we simply don't understand the nature of the universe. The Big Bang theory is fantastic at describing everything after that, but before it, we're a bit lost. At small enough scales, we don't even know if the word before even makes sense. But what if the Big Bang wasn't the beginning? Could there have been an earlier version of the universe with its own stars and galaxies? A universe populated perhaps by its own creatures, themselves wondering what came before their universe? Or might there be an infinite number of universes, endlessly branching out to create more and more universes? If so, does it even make sense to ask how that whole array of universes came into being? In trying to answer such questions, scientists bump up against the limits of the laws of physics. Existing theories can account for the evolution of the universe from its earliest moments, from a fraction of a second after the Big Bang, but the question of what came before has been among the most vexing in all of science. No one knows exactly what was happening in the universe until 1 second after the Big Bang, when the universe cooled off enough for particles like protons and neutrons to collide and stick together and start to form the first atoms. Many scientists do think that the universe went through a process of exponential expansion called inflation during that first second. This would have smoothed out the fabric of space-time and could explain why matter is so evenly distributed in the universe today. It's possible that before the Big Bang, the universe was an infinite stretch of ultra-hot dense material persisting in a steady state until, for some reason, the Big Bang occurred. For Stephen Hawking, the moment of the Big Bang was all that mattered. Before the Big Bang, he said, events were unmeasurable and thus undefined. Hawking called this the no-boundary proposal. Time and space, he said, are finite, but they don't have any boundaries or starting or ending points. The same way that the planet Earth is finite, but has no edge. Now, we've probably all had a copy of this book at some point. Whether we've read it or not is a different question. But he made this argument in A Brief History of Time, where he compares the idea that something might have existed before the Big Bang to the idea of something being south of the South Pole. There's nothing south from that point. The surface of the globe just ends. As hard as it is to imagine, perhaps, there was simply no time before the Big Bang. Another idea is that the Big Bang isn't the beginning of time, but rather that it was a moment of symmetry. So in this idea, prior to the Big Bang, there was another universe, identical to this one, but with disorder decreasing. This is called a mirror universe. So let me explain about disorder. Disorder is very important in physics because it tells us which way time goes. It gives us an arrow of time. So, for example, we know from looking at a video of fruit left in a bowl whether the film is being played forwards or in reverse. Increasing disorder in a system is telling us the direction that time is moving. And you might have heard Brian Cox talking about it as being increasing of something called entropy. Entropy just basically means disorder. So although we try to fight it, we are all tending to a more chaotic state. So in this mirror universe, this idea of a mirror universe, time would run opposite to time in our universe. And our universe would be in the past. Right, I will leave that. This is Roger Penrose. He put forward a theory that also says that the Big Bang wasn't the beginning of everything, but rather a moment in time when the universe switched from a period of contraction to a period of expansion. This big bounce idea suggests that there could be infinite Big Bangs as the universe expands and contracts and expands again. The problem with these ideas is there's no explanation for why or how an expanding universe would contract and return to the low chaos, the low disorder state. In 2004, physicists suggested that perhaps the universe as we know it is the offspring of a parent universe from which a bit of space-time has ripped off, and that something called a quantum fluctuation lets it happen. These baby universes are literally parallel universes and don't interact with or influence one another. You might have heard of something called string theory. In physics, string theory is just that, a theory. We have no experimental evidence for it at all, but it was developed from some very difficult maths to try and answer some very difficult questions about the universe and how it works. String theory is complicated, but it gives us a theory where universes periodically collide with each other, with each collision acting like a new Big Bang. So theoretical physicists have suggested that this happens throughout space so that we live in what we might call a multiverse, an array of universes in which ours is just a small part of a much vaster reality. In either case, the Big Bang was almost certainly not the ultimate beginning. Right now, no one knows what might have caused the Big Bang, but some physicists believe that whatever sparked it could have happened not just once, but many times, leading to a multitude of universes. If this theory is correct, the cosmos is continuously sprouting new universes like bubbles in a pot of boiling water. Another possibility is that time itself began at the moment of the Big Bang. If that's the case, there is no before at all. Scientists don't yet have a way to peer back to even the instant of the Big Bang, much less what came before it. The detection of gravitational waves from the powerful galactic collisions in 2015 opened up a possibility that these waves could be used to solve some of the fundamental mysteries about the universe's expansion in the first crucial second. Theoretical physicists also have work to do, like making more precise predictions about how quantum forces like quantum gravity might work. We don't even know what we're looking for until we have a theory. So what were things like before the Big Bang? The short answer is, we don't know. The long answer is, it could have been lots of things. Predictably, physicists continue to argue about which of these ideas deserve to be taken seriously. Explaining our universe as the product of some earlier universe sounds appealing, but what caused that universe to exist? In the end, the cosmos has, in the Big Bang, a credible origin story, but no compelling script for what came before time zero. Instead, we have a smorgasbord of competing theories which are all highly speculative. For me, as a scientist and a Christian, I also have lots of big questions. But my experience of life and the world so far is that there are always questions, and actually, I'm okay with that. I've given you lots of information about where the scientific creation story comes from. But like other creation stories, it is based on the evidence available at the time. Almost since the very first humans existed, they have tried to understand the workings of the world around them in their own way. The movements of the stars and the sun and the moon have long been a source of creation stories. Almost since our very beginnings, we have pondered our own existence, the why questions, and tried to make sense of it all, to find meaning in life itself. Brian Cox would say, this is what makes the human race special and unique amongst living creatures. When he's asked about life existing in other places in the universe, and I agree, the probability is yes, but humans are special. Amongst the exploration of the why questions, is there space for God and science? Speaking very personally, I see science as just one way of understanding the world. I talk to my students about their superpowers. Many of the students I teach have challenges with dyslexia and ADHD and attention and focus and mental health issues. But sometimes I try to convince them that that's what makes them special, because that gives them their own unique perspective on the world. I think that science is kind of like my superpower. It gives me a different perspective on the world. A famous scientist, Richard Feynman, was once asked, that doesn't knowing all the science and the theory take away from the beauty of something like a rose? And his response was that actually it makes it all the more beautiful, because as a scientist, I can understand how the tiny cells inside that flower work, how they are perfectly designed to do their job. Science can explain lots of things, but it certainly can't explain everything. It can't explain the sense of awe I feel when I look up at the night sky, especially if I'm lucky enough to see the beautiful northern lights. It might be able to tell me what the northern lights are and where they come from and why they happen, but it can't tell me why I feel moved when I see them. Science can't explain why we fall in love, what makes us laugh, what makes us smile and brings us joy, why the chemical composition of tears of grief is different from tears of joy. But God doesn't just fill the gaps where science reaches its limits. To me, the more I learn about the world and the universe through science, the more I understand how wonderful and amazing this world, this creation is, and for me, the closer I feel to God. Some people turn to poetry or music or art for spiritual inspiration, but for me, I turn to science. I feel like I may have blown your minds enough and given you enough to think about the origins of the universe for one evening, but I'm very happy to try and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Very much. Jennifer, shall we just pause for a moment? Because I feel a bit funny, really. We'll just be quiet for a moment before we have the questions. Do have a seat. Well, if you would like to ask, I can't help thinking, if I'd been taught science like that at school, I mightn't have had such trouble with it. Thank you so much. Questions? If you could ask a question rather than make a statement, that would really be much appreciated.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad you stopped when you did, because it was blowing my mind, but equally I could have listened to you for another 3 or 4 hours. So my question is kind of like your first one there, and I suppose just glossing it, it's so yes, we don't want a God of the gaps, but how do we say that God is in any sense the creator without, so how does that somehow, if God is in any meaningful sense the creator, surely he has to be involved in the creation of all that is. So how does that work? I don't know.
I think I can tell you my how I kind of reconcile that, if you like. I think science will go back, and as science progresses, we will start to understand more about the early universe, and we will start already there are cosmologists working a lot on ideas of what was before the Big Bang. You can go and hear talks where people will talk about what was before and how the universe might have come into being. And I think as science and particularly technology progresses, we will start to understand more of that process. However, I think my feeling is there'll always be the bit before that we don't know. There'll always be the bit before that we don't know. And to me, however far we go back, there's always a space for that unknown, that creation moment, if you like. For me, that is, and I don't want to be like Newton with the God who just sets it all off and watches it go, but, and you can argue about what that hand in creation might look like, as in, is it just set it all off and leave it, or is there more of a purpose in that? And for me, that's kind of where I find God, in that sense of purpose and design. I'm a bit of a in the teleological theory, you know, I can't remember his name, but the guy who picks up the watch and looks at the watch and says yes. And I cannot help, however much I know about science, but be absolutely amazed that there are, just take the flowers, there are so many different flowers, so many. Why do we need so many? We don't really need so many. There are so many different ones, and yet every single flower that you see is designed so perfectly to attract a very specific insect and to follow a very specific process. Now, to me, that is definitely beyond our human understanding. That's beyond humanity to understand that, the why. And a scientist wouldn't be, we don't care about the meaning questions at all. That's not what scientists are interested in. And to me, the meaning questions are the really interesting questions, and that's where I suppose that's where I experience God at work in creation. I don't know whether that answers your question. It's quite a personal thing.
I think I can speak without the microphone. No. All right, I will use the microphone. What's the difference between cosmos and universe? Apart from one is a thing and the other is a flower.
Yeah, so a cosmologist will look at the origins of the universe. So they'll be the researchers who will be looking at ideas before the Big Bang, all of that. So they'll be looking at, I tend to think the universe is what is around us now, whereas cosmologists will look at the whole story, wherever that might begin and wherever it might end. Whereas the universe, we tend to think as more of a, what we currently, beyond what we can experience, because the observable universe is very small, but is connected to our current circumstances and our current situation.
Thank you very much. I just wondered if you would like to comment on, say, the work of Ian McGilchrist and panentheism and the idea that consciousness and intentionality even goes down to this living cell and the atom even.
It's interesting. Yeah, interesting. Okay, there's something that I teach which you'll understand. So, in an electric circuit, and I teach this to teenagers, so it's okay. In an electric circuit, basically we have little charges moving around the circuit, and they carry the energy around. Okay, they pick the energy up from the battery and they take it around the circuit. Now, the circuit might have a branch, so it might have a place where the charge has to choose, do I go that way or do I go that way? And the question that my students will always say is because we know that half of them go that way, half of them go that way. And the question my students will say is, but how does that charge know which way it's supposed to go? Why doesn't all the charge go one way and that bit get no charge? And it's a good question. How does it know? And they always say, how does it know? As if it's got some thought. The answer is really complicated, and it's about the electric circuits aren't really electric circuits, and they're probability waves, and they're in all places at the same time. And it's a quantum kind of phenomenon. So actually, there's no decisions being made. In terms of, do atoms have a consciousness? My feeling is no. I will look at that piece of wood and say, does that have a consciousness? And for me, the answer is no. The atoms in that piece of wood don't. However, something special happens when we get life. And I think humans, animals, no problem, I get that. Consciousness, a very organized collection of cells, but much more than an organized connection of cells. Something special has happened. Plants, tricky. I'm no biologist. Plants amaze me. Plants absolutely amaze me, what they can do. And I struggle to believe that as something that has life, that there isn't an association of what you might call a consciousness that comes with it. That's my struggle. There will be people who disagree completely. I'm happy to accept that, but that's my way of working out.
beings being special.
Yes.
Given the fact that we've only been around for the last few seconds of 13.8 billion years, do you honestly believe that that time has been a preparation for us?
At the risk of being controversial and opening up a whole can of worms, the thing that I struggle with, the scientific theory that I really struggle with, is evolution. I really struggle with, we as human beings, just physically, our human bodies are absolutely incredible. They are amazing things. We can heal ourselves to some extent. We can live through all sorts of things, and we can do amazing things. What I really struggle with is the timescale. And I really struggle with one single cell to human beings which can contemplate their own existence and creation around them, and sit here and have a conversation about the meaning of life or whatever from a single cell in that time scale. I really find that hard. And I know there is evidence, and my biology teachers have to teach about the evolutionary evidence. I also know that there are gaps. In the fossil record, there are gaps. And yeah, I'm with you. I feel like it cannot be possibly enough time.
Now I want to ask a completely different question to the one I was thinking of a few minutes ago, but but I haven't worked out what it is yet, so I'm going to go back. I was thinking about Ian McGilchrist too, but the way I wanted to phrase a question to you is in the different paradigms and theories that you've explained about what has happened to everything that we know about since the Big Bang, all that stuff. Do most of those models contain the idea that everything has something in common with every other thing? Is it true to say that there's some, in my ignorance as a layman, I would think of it as the same kind of, there's a similarity surely in the energy within everything, isn't there? Within every particle. And we can talk about those. We know there are different kinds of energies, or it manifests itself in different, but there's a commonality in all the stuff in the universe, isn't there? Does that give you any pointers to an idea of where God might be in everything? And does it have a poetic resonance with you, with the idea of God as the ground of being, or the ground of our being?
Yeah, definitely. And I think children love to hear when we first talk about space. We are, all of us, part of the biggest ever recycling project. Every single atom of our being has at some point been something else. At one point, it was a star. So when you say to the children, that thing, we are stardust, we are stardust, we are. And that comes back to, what you said about consciousness and atoms. Atoms are recycled all the time. The air that we breathe, Picasso breathed. An atom in itself is not special in that way. However, there is a beauty in the commonality of it all. That those atoms came from a bunch of even smaller particles that all came from that same source. And what people of faith may say is that source, that ground of being. What is that source? We don't know. We talk about things like, you'll hear scientists say, oh, there was a quantum fluctuation. And I just want to say, what does that mean? What even does that mean? It's a kind of a get out, I think, because we don't know. And they don't want to go down, it might have been God. They don't want to say things like that. So they say this thing called quantum fluctuation. For me, that's that energy. And there's something else about, the more you learn about, the universe is so beautiful, because even when you do work out all the theories that describe, science just has theories to describe what we see around us. But there's the mathematics of them is so beautiful because it's all connected. And you see, when you're talking about, the forces between stars and planets, there's a resonance in that mathematics with the forces between the tiniest particles. Now, for me, that's not a coincidence and it's not an accident. And that, if you like, is that kind of energy, that godly energy that penetrates every aspect of the universe, and it is its essence, really, that we can't describe, and science will never be able to describe. And science doesn't want to. Science doesn't want to say, oh, why is that equation so similar to that equation when those two things are, worlds apart. They're not interested in why, they're interested in, could we bring them all together and make a grand theory to describe everything? Absolutely, try and do that. We don't really care about why they're similar, we just notice that they are and think, wow, what could we do with them? So that's for me. For other scientists will have a very different perspective.
Just picking up the point from my colleague here, I find the idea that these interesting little bipeds strutting around on a speck of dust in the corner of a universe, just wanting to understand how it began, is extraordinarily bumptious. So my question is, how do you react to turning Genesis on its head? Instead of saying God made man in his own image, that man made God in his own image, and in order to answer the questions that we all have about meaning and so on, which for me begins to explain why the Old Testament is so confused in its picture about God, because that's evolved. What do you think?
What do I think? Man made God. But I can see what you're saying. Why would man make God?
Well, answer the big questions about where did the sun come from? Oh, it must be made by something like us, but it's got to be much bigger. It has the same attributes as us. It has the same attributes as us. It gets angry, it gets sad, it walks with the children in the garden. The Old Testament God is exactly like a human being, but bigger. Invented by these bumptious little bipeds to answer the questions.
To some extent, and I think when the Enlightenment came, science came and took its place, because the scientists could answer a lot of questions. But I still go back to the point that there are certain questions that science cannot answer and will never be able to answer, because they are beyond what science even sets out to achieve. And I think, yes, do we invent then a God to answer those questions? A God of all the gaps, or the gaps that scientists can't fill? Possibly, for some people, they do. I think it's personal, and I think it probably comes down to personal experience. I think everybody has their story, and whether that might be a direct a religious experience, or whether it might be an experience of something just much more powerful than themselves, I think it's not something that believers have a monopoly on. I think many people experience things that are beyond humanity. And to me, that experience is absolutely beyond explanation. And I think to say we invent a God in order to understand it, I think what we need to do is deal with the fact that, and sit with the fact that there are many things that we just don't understand, and that's okay.
Thank you. I think you posited the question, what happened before the Big Bang? And I think you also said that the beginning of time is tied up with the Big Bang. So do you think those two things are incompatible? I mean, if there is no time, then what happened before doesn't exist.
Yeah, I think we don't know. I think this is the answer. There are some people, like probably Stephen Hawking is one of them, that would say time began at the Big Bang, and it doesn't even make sense to ask about before, because before implies that time existed before the moment of the Big Bang. And Stephen Hawking would say that's just a nonsense question. It doesn't make sense. There are scientists that will argue either way, and time is tricky. There are lots of very clever people who've written books on something like the arrow of time. Time is quite difficult in physics, because in physics we like symmetry, and most of the things in physics, the laws in physics, have symmetry. We don't like time because it only seems to go forward, and that seems to break symmetry. And that's why we're not very happy as scientists, because we like symmetry in things. And there are lots of much more clever people than I am, theoretical physicists, who will argue about that, what they call the arrow of time, and why it only seems to point in one direction. And yeah, and the thing will be when, and I say when, it won't be in my lifetime, but when time travel becomes a possibility, we may break into a whole new world of physics that we don't know about. At the moment, the laws of physics, there is nothing that disallows travel to the past. So all the mathematical laws say it's quite possible. However, we haven't done it yet. And we won't be able to do it until we can build a time machine in this time, and then we have to wait to the future so that we can come back to where the time machine is. So that's the reason we haven't got time travelers from the future coming back, because we need to have built a time machine for them to come back to. So that's what physics is at the moment. I can't really answer your question because it's kind of mysterious, and it's one of those things that we don't really know why, and we don't know how, and there are different ideas, but we're certainly not homing in on any one in particular at the moment.
Yes. Of course, I suppose going back in time, we've always invented gods to try and explain what we didn't understand. But now we've reached a point where we understand so much more about our world, our life. I can remember being challenged myself greatly when I understood that we are mainly space and that quarks, am I right, pass right through us.
Neutrinos.
Neutrinos, sorry,
Yeah.
I've got it wrong.
Yeah, no.
But neutrinos pass right through us.
Yep, hundreds of them.
Yes. I remember preaching a sermon about that, and it makes people really think. Do you think that perhaps Christianity might be the only religion? Because to me, this means God is even more fantastic. Christianity might be the only religion that can actually still function and survive so well because of Jesus' teaching and still embrace the wonders of what we're discovering, not just with the universe, but with our genes and how we work. Because we don't have, if you look at Jesus' teaching, there isn't really a problem. But if you look at the Old Testament, yeah, there's lots of problems.
Yeah. I don't know. What sort of problem are you thinking specifically about?
I was thinking that Jesus' teaching was very much about living and trying to bring more of heaven down on to earth. I know Christianities tend to make it into an escape route to heaven, but in fact his teaching, if you look at it, is very much about bringing heaven more to earth so that we create a better world. And that was very much what he was trying to do and continues. And if you look at Christianity, the impact it's had on the world, it's quite surprising, really, the positivity. And all I'm thinking of is that do you think you can have more scientists who are Christians than perhaps some of the other religions? I don't know.
I don't know really. My gut feeling is to say not, but I'm trying to think about why I feel that. I would say that actually, I don't know, when you talk about living and creating in the world, that sounds quite pragmatic. And I think what I'm trying to say is that I think creation is bigger than the world, bigger than humanity, it's bigger than all of that. Yeah, I think that's what I would say, and that with with the idea of I think Jesus limiting it to where Jesus walked and where Jesus lived. It's kind of that's only a small part of the picture. It's a really small part of the picture, and there's some amazing and beautiful things out there that Jesus wouldn't have known anything about in terms of, we're looking at pictures from the James Webb Space Telescope of the Eagle Nebula and the beauty of creation. I don't think it's intrinsically connected with necessarily the life of Jesus, as I suppose is what I was trying to say. Yes, sorry.
As a scientist, how would you approach preaching about miracles?
Yeah. It's hard, and I think, I was talking in chapel about the resurrection at school. You'll probably remember the old, what was it, a conjuring trick with bones, and I was like, really? It's hard. I can't. For me, it's where science won't give me the answer. And I have to choose for myself, do I believe it? And from that, I draw on my experience of God. And for me, I come down on the side of. I don't know how. I don't know what laws of physics were violated, what happened, but I believe it did. And I can't tell anybody else. I can give you a scientific argument that will convince you that the water turned into wine, this happened, that Jesus walked on the water. And actually, I don't want to even try to give you a scientific argument for that, because there's no place for science.
Asked a question yet? Who would like to ask? Okay, well, do we have somebody over? Oh yes, gentleman here. We'll try and fit you two in as well.
Thank you. I haven't given myself time to think that you were so quick to come around there then. Right at your beginning, no, I better rephrase that. I don't mean right at your beginning. At the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned